the Middle Ages is the flourishing of this culture that goes all the way back to antiquity, right? And that eventually, guided by Christianity, kind of blossoms and produces this beautiful icon of this eternal reality. Redemption of the cosmos is possible because the cosmos is held together and moved ultimately by the love of God. Dante calls it the love at the very end of Paradiso, the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Pitch for the discarded image, not just the book itself, which is a really beautiful introduction, but to the whole world that it introduces. And it's a much more, in some senses, dangerous world. I think there's something about the idea of a world that's just held together by these perfectly regular laws. There's something about that I think feels very safe and ordered and tidy, right? But the medieval cosmos, just like the medieval church, is an untidy and colorful place.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Dialogues with Derek. Joining me today is none other than Seraphim Richard Rohlin. How are you doing today, Richard?
I am okay. It has been, as I was explaining before we hit the record button, it has been just a wild and crazy week, or week and a half, or something like that. And I'm currently sitting here in my office. You can't see this on the camera, but I'm actually sitting here surrounded by everybody's Snow White books. So, or not everybody's, but a lot of people's. I have about 300 more orders here in my office. So we're working on getting those filled.
Yeah,
So,
I had a lot of people, saw a lot of questions, heard a lot of questions, people reaching out. Hey, have you heard anything about the Snow White
yep.
book? I haven't received mine yet.
Well, we know. We didn't know, but we know now. Yeah, I guess that's a good place to start with updates. Is the crazy Snow White adventure? If people read Jonathan's updates in the newsletter or on the Snow White Kickstarter.
I can share my screen real quick too, so
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah.
get an idea.
I mean, basically, whenever Jonathan launched the new God's Dog campaign, there was a whole bunch of people started reaching out and saying, "Hey, where's my stuff?" And Jonathan was like, "What? I thought everybody had their stuff." And so he flew down here to Dallas, and basically everything was really, really bad. You can read his update if you want specific details on it, but it was one of those beautiful things. I mean, it wasn't lost on us that all of this happened on Candlemas, right? On the feast of the meeting of the Lord in the temple. And which
Groundhog
is
Day.
Groundhog Day. Yeah, it's probably actually the most, other
It's
than the
perfect.
Ethiopia stuff. I mean, I don't know if this is true by the numbers, but certainly in terms of videos that people have come up to me and talked to me about, it's the Groundhog Day is probably the most popular thing that Jonathan and I have done together.
Yeah, it's
And
great.
Groundhog Day or Candlemas is all about the light appearing in the darkness, and that's really what the last week has been. It's funny because
Crazy.
at some point, Jonathan and I were talking about some different things and prayer and whatnot, and he said, yeah, mystical things don't really happen to me. I believe that they happen. They just, and then I'm like with him for a week, and he's just like this nonstop vortex of things happening, like mysterious, wonderful, terrible, like mystical things constantly happening around him. And I was like, oh, so mystical things don't happen to you, huh? Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's and maybe it's better not to notice these things, um but noticing things is my superpower. So
Yeah.
anyway, so that's been the last week and a half. So I'm a little tired, and I'm gonna apologize in advance if I'm just like a little tired, but definitely if you don't have your Snow White book at this point, I think we know, and we're working to make sure that everybody gets the rest of their stuff. So
Man, a lot of weird
yeah,
stuff. Because people ask me because I have a few unboxing videos and they're now that
yeah.
it's become a thing, they're kind of expecting it. And so
Oh,
they're like,
neat.
hey, where's your unboxing video? I was like, I'll do one when I get one. And I went and checked and like my order is ghosted. Like I don't have any evidence whatsoever that I even
You told me
purchased
that.
it,
Yeah.
which is
Well,
crazy
uh,
because I remember like I saw the confirmation page, like it was all there and all of a sudden like just nothing, not on
did you do
anybody's
it
end.
in Kickstarter or in BackerKit? Anyway, it doesn't matter. We'll figure it out later. We'll figure it out
It,
later. I have the
yeah,
list of everybody who ordered and doesn't have their stuff. So we'll figure that out later. But yeah, in the meantime,
figured out.
everybody just like I've kind of stepped in to help Jonathan get the rest of this fulfillment done, and he's also got a team of just really
Nice.
wonderful people who are helping get this fulfillment finished. People all around the globe. So we're gonna make sure everybody gets their stuff, and yeah, that's all I can say about it, except that, like I said, we're gonna try to make sure everyone gets their stuff. So
Wow, man.
yeah,
So yeah, they had Rescuing Snow White, The
rescuing
Adventures
Snow
of
White.
Seraphim Richard Rohlin and Jonathan Pageau.
It was it was awesome. I mean, at some point we had just like all of this. We had to go somewhere and actually get all of the Snow White books that had just been shipped to this random location, and that's why at least, like 700 of them hadn't shipped out. And so we put them all in my Suburban, and we were driving around, and the Suburban, which for people who don't know, I mean, it's like a large SUV. Like it's basically as big an SUV as
Classic.
you can roll, right? Well, I have a lot of kids, and so this your options
Yeah.
become more and more limited as you have more children. And but literally, the Suburban was so full that the very last box had to go in Jonathan's lap. So we're driving around all week for like 4 days. And every time he gets in the car, he has to take this box out, get in, and then put a box in his lap. And then every time he gets out, he has to step out and then put a box back in the front seat. And we started calling it his burden. This is kind of like Pilgrim's Progress or something, right? This
Mm,
is,
yeah.
his burden. But
Yeah, it's
yeah,
almost like a hero's journey,
yeah,
Pilgrim's Progress, totally.
yeah, it's been wild. I mean, I'm still kind of like, I think my wife and I are just like still in recovery mode from, and of course, while Jonathan was down, I was like, well, obviously you have this incredibly stressful situation, so I should also make sure to fill your social calendar as much as possible. That would be a good thing to do. Um, I'm I wouldn't say
Good
that
man.
I'm an extrovert, but I'm definitely more extroverted than he is, and so I think I wore him out a little bit, but everybody down here, I mean, we've been trying to get Jonathan to come to Dallas for years. It's just never worked
Oh,
out. And so he came and very graciously gave a talk at the cathedral, and we talked about the iconography of the cathedral. If folks, if you're ever out in Dallas, come to St. Seraphim Orthodox Cathedral. The iconography is just some of the best in the country, I think,
mm,
and it's just really beautiful. And not a large building by any stretch, but also a massive building,
mm.
in a spiritual sense, just in terms of, opening uh you up to the to paradise. So
Yeah.
anyway, Jonathan came and gave a wonderful talk to us, and also came. We have some people who meet at my house on Fridays for the book club, and
Ooh, book
so
club.
so Jonathan came, and we ended up just like asking him fun questions about symbolism and fairy tales, and sitting out by the fire. It was great. So anyway,
Love
so
it.
so so we were able to
Love it.
prevail on him to kind of come out and be a little sociable and talk to us a little bit, and then you know uh but like I said, I think I wore him out by the end, but
Yeah.
but hopefully he got a good taste of Texas hospitality. I tried to take him
Love
to
it.
all the best barbecue places and all that stuff. So
Mm,
that's been the last week and a half. It's just been a weird time. It's been a weird
yeah.
time.
Well, how apropos, because as people who are tuning in know, our discussion today is centered around The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis. It is the last published book that Lewis made. It's a very interesting book, somewhat overlooked book,
Mm,
but critical
for
to
sure.
his work and really the development of what's happening in the symbolic world. And I'm really glad that he published it before his passing. But before we get into that, I wanted to check in on a few other projects since I have you, Richard. Richard, this is great because this is the first time that you and I have had a one-on-one dialogue
Yeah.
because the other ones have been in more of like a roundtable
Yeah,
discussion.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So let's go ahead and check in with some other projects that you have going on.
Mm.
I suppose, 10 minutes in or so is a good time to give you a formal introduction. So
Yeah, fair enough.
yeah, so we're not we do a non-linear podcast here.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
so uh, Mr. Roland is the producer, co-host of Amon Sul, the podcast that centers around the counterpart to Lewis, his contemporary Tolkien. And you see, you guys go over a lot of the religious themes or
Mm. Yeah.
symbolism that's nested
Um,
into the Orthodox frame.
yeah, Father Andrew and I do the podcast together, and essentially what we do is we read the works of J.R.R. Tolkien as Orthodox Christians, right? And so we're just sort of bringing that perspective to things, but and just the ways that, I think for Father Andrew and I both, we probably wouldn't be Orthodox without Tolkien.
Wow.
And certainly there's something in Tolkien that awakens a certain kind of person to a world of uh, uh, enchantment, or you could say like a sacramental imagination.
Hmm.
And that's what brought us, by many highways and byways, that's what brought both of us. He's the son of evangelical missionaries. I'm the son of evangelical missionaries and evangelical pastors. And so, in that sense, not very likely people to be, to become Orthodox. Although obviously a lot of people have done that now. But
Hmm.
but
Tolkien also
for
had a lot of children too.
yes,
Big
yes,
family.
yeah, for sure. So yeah, anyway, for Father Andrew and I both, or Tolkien was an important part of coming to Orthodoxy. And it's interesting because I think that um, reading Tolkien has always been associated with a certain kind of, let's say, resistance to the spirit of the age.
Mm.
In fact, initially he was really, really popular with like hippies, which he was a little dismayed by. Tolkien
Don't
himself,
say.
Tolkien
Wow.
himself, not a hippie. Very, very, um, yeah, very traditional guy in a lot of respects, right? And
Yeah.
so there were definitely parts of that whole movement that would have been like the sexual revolution and things like that that were
Mm.
really, really totally contrary to what,
Yeah.
the way that he saw the world. But the reason that I think that his book attracted these people was because they recognized um uh that there really was something deeply wrong with like Western culture in the
Mm.
50s and 60s, right, coming out of the Second World War, and something kind of oppressive and totalizing about the modern state. And anyway, all of that stuff. I don't want to get into politics right now, but essentially, uh, reading Tolkien has always been kind of associated with a sort of counterculture or resistance to the spirit of the age, as I called it.
Mm.
And
Mm.
I saw just the other day that now, like, reading Tolkien is one of the things that's on a list of like potential subversives. Like if you're,
Oh,
for
right.
some government agency, right? And so I was like, well, yeah, I guess that checks out. But yeah, so we read Tolkien's works as Orthodox Christians, and
Yeah.
yeah, that's it. So
The other thing that Richard does is come up with board games, and I'm just
yeah.
curious how the Emboria project is
Yes.
going.
Yeah, so Emboria, role-playing in the world under starlight, is a tabletop. It's actually
Role-playing
a
game,
tabletop
excuse me.
role-playing game. That's right. I do come up with board games, but board games are really expensive to publish, and so none of them have seen the light of day yet. But maybe one of these days. But yeah, this is a tabletop role-playing game set in a fantasy world, which I've been working on for actually most of my life. And I've talked about it in detail some other places. I think that at some point, we should have a conversation about this maybe, because there's some weird stuff going on, like
Mm.
symbolically, there's some weird stuff going on in Emboria, and I would love to
Yeah.
just like talk about it. But um,
It's on my
so that
list for
yeah,
unboxing, by the way.
awesome. Well,
Yeah.
I promise you're going to get yours.
Yeah.
The fortunately we have some very good people who are in charge of the
Yeah.
fulfillment for Kickstarter fulfillments for Strange Owl Games, which is the company that's publishing the game. And so you'll definitely get your book. But um, anyway, yeah, it's coming along great. If you backed the project, you should be getting a layout of the monster chapter pretty soon. Basically, the art has been finished. It's in layout right now. And you should also probably by the end of the month be getting a draft of the second book, which is Thunder in the North. So if you backed at the level to get the campaign book, you should be getting a full draft of that by the end of February. So it's coming along. I think some people are aware that uh, we've had some health issues. Both myself, I had a really nasty bout with heavy metal poisoning last year, and then also John Matthew, who's the line editor for Strange Owl Games, had a very, very close brush with death via bacterial meningitis. So it's been kind of like we had a couple of health scares that pushed our production schedule out a little bit, but it's coming along. And like I said,
Oh, man.
you'll probably have drafts of everything. The draft of the core book is already out, but you'll have a draft of the campaign book by the end of this month. And also you'll get to start seeing, as the core book is now with the editors and the layout people, you'll get to and the art's being finished, you'll get basically we're going to share those chapters as they're laid out so that people can see the progress. So very
Cool.
excited about that. Very excited about that.
I'm glad you're doing better, man.
Yeah.
It's intense.
This last year, man, it's been crazy. And I think that 2024 is going to be an incredibly weird year. I think for
Mhm.
everybody, for the world, for our community, for everybody. Yeah. Yeah. And the
Well,
other project that I know that people will want to know about is a book that we're putting together. There's a whole lot of Symbolic World people involved in it called Finding the Golden Key.
oh
And I
yes,
know several people have written to
yeah,
me very concerned, hey, is my essay ever going to be published, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah.
I really have to say, first of all, that I deeply appreciate everybody's patience. We were going one direction initially when we were going to start publishing the book like 2 years ago, and that didn't work out. And so since then, I've been trying to figure out, should I self-publish this or try to find some other home for it? The good news is that it's going to be published by Symbolic World Press. Basically, that'll be the next thing that I work on for the press as soon as we get over the current hurdles. So hopefully sometime later this year. And that's still the goal.
Awesome,
Still the goal is
awesome.
to get it published in 2024.
Yeah, I know. I helped proofread one of the
Yeah, yeah,
articles,
yeah, yeah.
and it was like, this is going to be great. Can't
It's gonna
wait.
be it's gonna be awesome. And we're gonna have some really great cover arts. Hugh Rose has already, as some of you in the
Mm,
Symbolic World community are probably aware of him,
yeah, yeah.
he's already agreed to do a cover for it, and we have something in mind. We just have to, pay him and then get that done. But all this is gonna be happening. So um it's going to be awesome, and I really appreciate everybody's patience. I'm going to try to send a note out to everybody who's involved in the project, just letting them know where we're at, but still planning on publishing that sometime this year through Symbolic World Press.
Fantastic,
And that probably
fantastic.
won't be originally. We were thinking we'd do a crowdfunder. At this point, probably won't be. It'll probably just be just a book that we publish, and we'll kind of announce it when it comes out. So
Okay.
yeah.
Another thing coming up just around the corner is the Symbolic World Summit down in Florida.
Yes.
And I know
Are
that
you coming?
I'm there, man. I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna be visiting
Awesome.
with James and
Love it.
Neil, a bunch of other
Love it.
people that have been on the podcast, get to meet them all in person. Just can't wait. I'll go ahead and share screen again for you watching the video version of the podcast. Um, yeah, so the cool thing is that Roland, you're going to be one of the speakers. And
I
so
am.
I'm just curious, like, what are you looking forward to in the event, and what are you going to be talking on?
Oh boy. I am looking forward to so many different things about the event. I'm looking forward to just meeting all my internet friends in person. When
Yes.
Jonathan came down here last week, it was the first time that we'd ever actually hung out in the flesh, and that was just really wonderful. And I'm looking forward to that same kind of feeling with so many other people. Neil deGrade from Dirt Poor Robins is somebody whose artistic vision I just deeply love and admire, and he's just this constant font of creativity. I'm looking forward to getting to hang out with him. The fact that I get to be at an event with Martin Shaw, I mean, this is like 10 years ago. If you'd been like, okay, man, this is your life in 10 years. You're going to be an Orthodox Christian and you're going to be at an event with Martin Shaw, who's also going to be an Orthodox Christian by then, and like all this other stuff. I would have been like, you're crazy. There's no way any of this is going to happen. So
Hmm.
I get
Yeah.
to just getting to be there. Obviously, Father Stephen Young, somebody I consider to be a good friend. He and I are going to be doing actually our track together, which is very nerve-wracking for me because I'm going to be all the things I'm going to be talking about are things that he's the expert in, but I'm going to be the one talking about them.
Yep.
So, yeah, so we're going to do so I'm looking forward to a whole bunch of I'm looking forward to the just being with all of you people in person and being able to talk about some of these things that we all really care about. And I think that I think it's going to be an awesome event. So yeah, that's what I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to. As far as uh, I mean, what do you want me do you want me to talk about what I'm going to be talking about, or
Well, how about we do this?
yeah,
Because I know people came here, they're just dying to know more about this
yes,
incredible book by C.S. Lewis
yep,
that is so central to real. Oh, the other thing worth mentioning is here we have the Universal History track. I know you've quoted the book a bunch,
yes.
but I just wanted to give a lot of breathing room in this episode for you to explain just how influential the book is and then help people understand it. Because when the first time that I went to read it, I think I made it halfway through, and I was like the section that has, the review of the four different pieces of literature from the
Yeah.
medieval ages, and I was just like, "Ooh, I need to move on to something else." And then I came back to it 2 years later, after having learned and worked on all these other things, and I had a
Yeah.
different perspective, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is great." But it took a little bit of excavation for me to get to the core of that, to where it actually hit home.
Well,
And so I'm thinking, well, if maybe there's some other readers in my position that would appreciate knowing
yeah.
more about the book to help them understand really what's going on.
So let me start with a story because this will also kind of tie into how I became the universal history guy. Like all this stuff is super related, and it all starts with a girl. It all starts with a girl.
Ah, as
Um,
most stories
as
that
most
are worth
stories,
telling are.
good stories do, right?
Yes.
So, I met my current wife. I say current wife, only wife. I met my wife. Um, what I meant to say is I met the woman who is currently my wife when I was 10 years old, and she was 14. And when you're a 10-year-old boy, when you're a 14-year-old girl, you don't remember 10-year-old boys. But if you're a 10-year-old boy, you do remember 14-year-old girls, right? This is how
Mm.
this works, right? So, I met her when I was 10, she was 14, and I said to myself, I am going to marry that girl. And
Wow.
I spent the next 10 years of my life making that happen. And so in order to do this, because of course, there's other guys interested in her and they're all older than me and stuff. So I had to like do everything on this really accelerated kind of
Mm.
a program. And so I I finished college, my undergrad, when I was 19 years old.
Wow.
And when I was 20, we got married.
I love it.
And
It's great.
and we have 5 children now.
Oh,
And
yes.
we've been married, a while. And and it's been wonderful. And I wouldn't change anything about it. One of the things that this meant was that, and the other thing to mention, and I did a really kind of a deep dive into some of my background in a conversation I did with Paul Vanderklay. So people who want to
Mm.
know kind of more about the specific culture that I grew up in can maybe go and watch that video. But
Yeah. Yeah.
essentially the culture that I grew up in. So I'd always been really attracted to ancient stories, right? To the Middle Ages, to things like Narnia and the Lord of the Rings, and to uh, let's say like the spicier parts of the Old Testament, stuff like that. Like that was the stuff that was really interesting to me. And when I was in my late teens, I basically put all of that stuff aside, both because I was like hyper focused on just trying to get through school, so I could marry this girl. And also because the culture that I was in, which was a fundamentalist, evangelical subculture, really emphasized um, things had to be really practical. Things had to be really practical, and there was the sense that stories and storytelling was not practical. It wasn't functional, and in fact, maybe in certain ways, it could be dangerous.
Mm.
And which is certainly true. It can be dangerous. But not everything dangerous is bad. That's which is one of the early lessons that Narnia taught me. So anyway, so I kind of put all that stuff away and just focused on like getting the degree and getting life started and everything. And I find myself when I'm maybe 22 or so years old, uh, sitting at my desk, and at this point I'm on pastoral staff, which is one of the things that I've been also focused on during that time was my theological education.
Mm.
I'm on pastoral staff, and I'm also married. I've got my first child on the way, and I have um, uh, a really good job, a really good secular job that's paying the bills and all this different stuff. So like basically all the things that I was supposed to do with my life, I'm 22 years old and they're done. And everything that everybody had been telling me, you have to do these things, right? It's all done.
Mhm.
I'm sitting there and I just feel cold and empty.
Mm.
And it's not because I had an unhappy marriage or anything like that, but there was something missing from my life. There was something missing from my life. And so I um I decided to just sort of go back, and it wasn't even like I remember sitting at my desk. I remember that moment. But I just sort of found myself gravitating, you could say gradually over the course of the next few weeks, to just going back to the things that brought me joy and beauty and wonder in my childhood. And so
Yeah.
I went back to Narnia. I went back to the Lord of the Rings. And as I was kind of like looking around for what are some other things that I could read that are kind of like this, it somebody recommended, just like online, somebody recommended C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image.
Ah, okay.
And I said, well, I love Lewis, and of course I'd read all of his apologetics as a young evangelical. It's sort of like a rite of passage,
Like Mere
you know.
Christianity,
Yeah, when you're
miracles.
like, dude, I could argue with an atheist, like that's a moment in like every young
Bro.
evangelical life, right? Um, uh, but yeah, so I'd read, I was familiar with a lot of his stuff, but I hadn't really read any of his scholarly stuff, like the I think in your notes you're calling it Lewis's day job stuff, right? Which
Yeah.
this definitely is. So
Hmm.
I got a copy of The Discarded Image and I read it, and it was like everything basically. I read two things right at that time. One was Lewis's Discarded Image, and the other was Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. And those two things together sort of helped me put my world back together.
Mm.
And when I read through The Discarded Image in particular, I was so blown away by the world that Lewis introduces you to. And this is really how to think about the book, is that Lewis is trying to introduce you to a world which is past, which is lost, right? Which um, for most people is not the world that they live in, right? Even if maybe it actually is secretly, but for most people, it's not the world that they actually live in. And by the way, we all know this. This is why stories, uh, uh, sometimes called like magic portal fantasy or magical realism, also, things like this. This is why those stories are really compelling, really grip you. I mean, Narnia being an early example of this, but there's lots of other examples that people have written since. This a realization that there's actually a parallel world or a secret world with hidden inside the regular world, and everything in that world is magical and alive and actually the way that you always kind of thought it should be, right? And so this is what you get in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is that children encounter what are
Mhm.
actually just all of these different archetypes from children's fiction and literature, witches and fauns and Father Christmas and so on. They're
Mhm.
encountering all of these things, but they're encountering them vivid and alive, and with all of the with all the sharp corners left on, you know um
Mhm.
and and it's
Yeah.
and it's this sense of, I mean, again, this is one of the most important things that you can learn, is that not everything that is dangerous is bad, right? And not everything that is good is safe, right? Aslan, he's not safe, but he's good. He's not a
Yeah.
tame lion,
Mr.
right?
Beaver says that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So if you
Yes.
can get that, if you can get that in your head and then sort of point that towards Christ, I mean, this is the thing. Like, if you really meet Jesus Christ, it will completely ruin your life. I mean,
Mm.
you won't be able to be the same anymore, and you won't be able to be a successful American anymore, and you won't be able to, like, it's going to really, really disrupt things,
Mm.
right? If you meet the Christ of the Gospels, I mean, who is a bizarre and perplexing and vexing and sometimes completely unhelpful person. I mean, just go read the Gospels. Anytime somebody asks
Mm.
Jesus a question, they don't get anything like a helpful answer. And uh and you can tell, like, the disciples are frustrated. They're coming like, come on, Jesus, like, come on, just
Did you
like,
even hear what I asked?
or just like, you can't say this, Jesus. People are gonna leave, right? There's
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
sense. Um,
Absolutely.
but yeah, so I immersed myself in all of that stuff. When I read The Discarded Image, the world that Lewis was introducing me to, I found to be really beautiful and compelling, and just deeply, on a very intuitive level. I'm actually not a super abstract person, which is funny because, like, the kinds of
Mm.
math I was always good at in school were the um like the more abstract kinds of math, right?
Mm.
But I'm not
Okay.
really an abstract person. Like I don't think in terms of like metaphysical realities and things like this.
Okay.
Everything's very concrete for me, I guess you could say.
Okay.
I don't think of there's no God in the abstract, right? There's no like God of the philosophers. Like
Mm.
let's talk about God, the concept of God in the abstract. I'm not saying that that's not useful for some people, but for me, it's totally uninteresting. I just kind of zone out. The only God that I'm interested in is the one that I eat on Sunday mornings. If things have got to be, so in that sense, everything is very concrete, and that's one of the things that I really loved about the Middle Ages is that it is this period of, not to say there aren't like great metaphysics and things like that that developed during the Middle Ages, but there's an immediacy to the world that I think that gets sort of lost in modern time. So
Hmm.
what I decided to do when I read The Discarded Image, and of course, it's essentially kind of a survey, and of course, it's taken from lectures that Lewis gave, but it's essentially a survey of medieval literature
Hmm.
and sort of the parts of medieval so these sort of seminal works of medieval literature that Lewis says, if you really want to understand this period, you have to read these books. And
Yeah.
then he goes on from there to kind of expound on the medieval model, right? So what I decided to do was to read everything that Lewis talks about in The
Mm.
Discarded Image.
Hmm.
And that's how I went on to do my graduate degree in medieval literature and languages. And
Wow.
that's basically why I became an Orthodox Christian. And that's basically
Mm-mm.
how I got involved in basically everything that I've done since then. So this book is
Ooh,
really,
wow.
it was like a major watershed for me, and it still
Yeah.
is. I mean, I go back to it relatively frequently. I've led a couple of um studies through it, and yeah, yeah.
Mm. Do you have a
So
copy of the book with you? Which version do you have?
I think that I've given away all of my copies. This actually
Oh,
happens pretty frequently, but I have it on Kindle here in front of me. But
yeah.
um,
All right.
I might have a copy. I might have a copy. My Lewis shelf is over
Here's Lewis
there.
shelf. Oh, there's mine. Here. I just wanted
I
to
don't.
take a moment.
Yeah, I don't think that I do have a copy. I have.
Yeah, here's mine here.
Yeah, there you go.
So
I
I just wanted to take a moment, just take a fun little break to show you something, because I think I actually have the coolest copy in the
okay.
world that exists.
All
Okay.
right.
So the title is The Discarded Image.
Mm-hmm.
I purchased this on thriftbooks.com. It's one of my favorite places to buy books that aren't, brand new. Typically brand new books I buy is say like stuff that's published on Symbolic World Press or things that my friends are doing. I get to be part of that release experience. Um, but otherwise, especially older books, I like to buy on thriftbooks.com. Or one of my favorite things to do is just go to thrift stores and just hunt. It's like a treasure hunt for me because you end up finding gems like this one. So I bought
Mm-hmm.
this one for maybe $5, right? It was on the clearance shelf, so to speak. And I get it, and it turns out that it's a library copy and it has like the due date tab on it and everything. And in the first page is a giant stamped inked word. Can you guess what word that says? Discarded. So I
That's
have a
awesome.
discarded library copy of the discarded image.
That's fantastic. Man, that is, whoo, that's chilling is what that is. Um, yeah, because that's the whole point, right? The reason it's the discarded image, right? Of course, another word for image, same word in Greek, right, is icon, right? Um,
Ah,
and that's the way to really think about it is that uh gets to this idea as well through when he talks about medieval literature as the great rood screen. That was his term for medieval poetry and literature. But the idea is that if you took all of the say the culture produced by the Middle Ages, the architecture and the literature and so on and so forth, if you took all of that and put it together, you could say this is an icon of the kingdom of heaven. That it's revealing something about um, a um, something that's not bound by time, right? Something that's an eternal reality. And this is important. This is really important because uh, it's not enough, and I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened. I've always been somebody who likes old things. Um, but there was a shift. There was a turning point, probably about the time that I became Orthodox. But there's a difference between just being somebody who likes old things, right? And so basically, you're always kind of living in in nostalgia, uh, versus again that immediacy, that I was talking about a moment ago. And if you just live in nostalgia, then you become the sort of, I mean, my friends poke fun at me all the time because as I get older, I just started wearing vests and smoking pipes and things like this, and they're like, you're just becoming that guy, and and certainly,
Yeah.
certainly that is true, but there is this sort of this image of the nostalgia guy, sort of sitting in his tattered armchair, smoking a pipe, and he's reading about all of these wild and wonderful things. But he's got a safe distance
Mhm.
between himself and those things, and that it doesn't really uh and this is the guy who maybe like quotes some Latin, for as he's going, but it doesn't really change the way that he lives his life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think we have to be really careful of.
Mm.
Because you can kind of, trying to think of like a less extreme way to say this. But you can kind of you could like nostalgia your way right into hell if you're not careful. Because you uh you know
They have that in
I
The Great Divorce. They
yeah,
have that where
exactly.
you find certain levels of
Yeah,
hell where it's
yeah,
well inhabited by theologians and
yes,
philosophical
yes,
thinkers.
yes. And that is hell. Like that, the to like sit around and just think about these ideas, and then never actually be able to kind of embody them in any way, right?
Mhm.
A- a- and of course, like, well, most importantly, to never repent, right? Our
Ah,
repentance is the thing
yeah.
that all of this should be leading us to. I mean, if there's anything
Yeah.
that's missing,
Yeah.
from the kind of like inklings adjacent
Hmm.
discourse of like people who, there's a Venn diagram overlap right here of people who like to talk or write about the inklings. I'm one of those guys. And maybe they're also really into classical education. I'm also one of those guys. And maybe they're also really into just like old things and craft beer and like whatever else, like that guy, right? But um there's a significant kind of Venn diagram over you say that there's like all these qualities that are often kind of packaged together, and that produces somebody kind of like me. But then what's missing from the conversations that people like me are usually having about this stuff is any kind of repentance, any kind of
Hmm.
ascetic struggle,
Yeah.
um, things like this. And so I think that you have to be very, very, very careful just to not just let this stuff be like, isn't this kind of neat? Because what you'll end up doing is, when we talk about the faults in the book in a minute, I'll give you some examples of place that Lewis does this, right? And
You mean
like
where
who,
like Lewis falls short?
yeah, and who am
Okay,
I to
interesting.
criticize C.S. Lewis, right? But I'm gonna,
Yeah.
it's
Hey,
see it.
I don't know if you got a chance to listen to it. One of the talks that I had with Jonathan Pageau, he accidentally calls him St. Louis.
Hmm, that's funny. That's funny. I
Yeah.
don't think Lewis is a saint, but he's certainly a great man, and I
No,
certainly,
and I just say that because I think
yeah,
I would call it a somewhat appropriate slip because a lot of
sure.
people, including myself, look up to him just for
Yeah.
how influential he is
I
and
mean,
opening doors into whole other realms that changed my life.
my second son is named Edmund Percival Lewis Rohlin. So I mean,
That enough
so,
said right there.
yeah. So there's no, nobody esteems him more highly than I do,
Yeah.
but I do think he gets one or two very critical things wrong in the discarded image, and we can talk about that. But
Yeah, let's go
and
over
it
what he does
yeah, yeah,
well,
yeah, yeah,
and we'll
yeah,
dig
yeah.
into it.
So but just to kind of finish the point that I was
Yeah,
making,
please.
what you'll end up doing if you just do this stuff, and it's kind of always held at arm's length, is that you'll end up kind of filtering out the parts that you don't like, and you'll make it safe, right? And that's the dangerous thing. I mean, if you were to, I'll give an extreme example of this, that everybody who watches your channel will be equally ticked off by, and so it's like it'll be safe for this audience. Okay. So there was a book that came out recently. I won't name the book because I don't want to, direct. Well, anyway, I'm not going to call the
Okay.
author out here, but
Okay.
there's a book that came out very recently, and it was about religion in the Middle Ages, and it was getting some really good reviews and things like this. And so I bought the book. I started reading it. And in the introduction, the woman who wrote the book, she starts talking about how like she's grew up evangelical in a really strict kind of household, and medieval Christianity was the thing that really kind of basically kind of opened her eyes to like there are some other ways of being a Christian. And I'm like, so far so good. Like I'm tracking, that's my story as well, et cetera, et cetera. And then the story keeps going, or she keeps going, and I'm like, okay, seems like maybe she's got some more liberal leanings, which is kind of a weird thing to take away from medieval Christianity, but I'll hear her out. I'll hear her, I'm trying to give her a fair hearing and everything.
Hmm.
And then she
Hmm.
gets to this point where she says, okay, so before we start talking about the things I like about the Middle Ages, so doing the reverse of what we're trying to do here, I need a caveat it with here's all the bad things about the Middle Ages, and just get that out of the way so everybody knows these things are bad. And then she says, the very first thing she says is, in the Middle Ages, everyone hated women, even the women.
Whoa.
So, which is
Dang.
at that point, I returned the book.
Yeah, that's kind of a
I just
non-starter there. Jeez.
yeah, I just like, so if you start out with everybody in the Middle Ages was very hateful, like deeply hateful towards women, including the women, then it's, well, okay, at that point you've just basically taken a whole bunch of things off the table,
Hmm.
that would have been fun to talk about, right?
Yeah.
One of my favorite things, just as an aside, is when people talk about Hildegard von Bingen, who's a Western saint and mystic, um, um, very accomplished, talented woman, and a nun, an abbess of a monastery in Germany, and I think a holy person. I really believe that. A lot of people look at her as like a sort of a proto-feminist figure or something like this. But my favorite, and but one of her most important theological treatises is on how women are ontologically unfit for the priesthood. So it's kind of but this author would look at that and say, well, here's an example of, obviously, Hildegard just hates women, which is nonsense. She doesn't hate women. She just believes something different from what you believe, right? And so, but this is an example of
Hmm.
this is somebody who is interested in medieval theology, not in a sense that she would ever want to become, a medieval Christian, right? But just in a sense that she wants to kind of keep it at this safe distance from herself and pick out the things that she thinks are kind of neat or kind of validate the way that she feels about the world, but isn't
Yeah.
willing to really accept it for what it is. And
Yeah.
this is something that I think we need to be a little careful about. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's why it kind of when we think about the image, right, it's the icon, right? That medieval culture produced this icon of an eternal reality, and the Middle Ages is past. I'm sorry to say, nobody's sorrier about it than I am, but the Middle Ages is past, but the eternal reality is always with us.
Mm.
And that's something that you can directly enter into and participate in, even if you find yourself living in 21st century
But
America.
still, just to
So
think about the magnitude, you're saying the cumulative productions of architecture and literature and
yeah,
society and all of that is like culminated together and presented as one image
yeah.
that follows, similar principles and patterns.
It's
That's
a very
astounding.
and it's a very complicated image, and certainly not near. I mean, one of the reasons when the Enlightenment comes along, one of the reasons that they're I mean, to talk about architecture for a second, when the Enlightenment comes along and like the neoclassical revival and all of that stuff, one of the things they start doing is building buildings in imitation of the buildings of classical Greece and Rome, right? Our nation's capital, which
Oh,
I've recently been to,
yeah.
is full of such buildings, right? Because it and our Constitution and all those things is fundamentally a product of the Enlightenment. And but one of the interesting things about it is that these ancient buildings in Greece and Rome,
Mhm.
the only surviving examples of which are almost all churches, by the way. The
Yeah.
Parthenon is a church, and so on and so forth. Um, uh, uh, the Pantheon in Rome is what I meant. But
Right.
actually, the Parthenon was also a church. It was a Christian church longer than it was a pagan temple. But
Oh,
yeah, yeah. These buildings were not white. They were painted. Everything was painted. The
what did they
ancient
paint?
world, that they painted the columns, they painted the bricks, they painted the marble, the stones.
Oh,
They painted all of their statues. I mean, those beautiful like white marble statues or whatever, they were all painted.
what?
Everything was, yeah. So the whole ancient world, and then going from there into the Middle Ages, all the great cathedrals of Western Europe were painted just like Orthodox churches are painted now. I mean, if you look at you can, because they've found the pigments in the stones and they've used that to for like these beautiful cathedrals, Chartres, or Notre Dame, and so on. They've found like the pigments in the stones, and you can find digital where they've done like a digital reproduction of, it wasn't granite, it wasn't just bare granite going up the ceiling.
What?
This was like these buildings were beautifully painted, just like the interior of like a normal Orthodox cathedral would be now. Maybe with different colors, a different color palette because you're in a different region, or maybe and maybe not always like big fresco icons, maybe some other stuff, but it was all brightly painted. I mean, this is the point that
Hmm.
I'm trying to make. And you can go read books about this in the like history of art. There's a couple of good ones that have come out recently, and I can't remember the name of them, but I have a buddy who's really into this stuff, and so he's been reading it. We've been talking about it. This information during the Enlightenment and the neoclassical period was actively suppressed. It was actively suppressed by, like, whenever they find evidence of, oh, these columns or something were painted, they would just like suppress that information because to them color was part of the messy, irrational Middle Ages. And what
Oh,
they wanted to do was like create an ordered world that was actually this totally really a totally bogus version of late antiquity that never really existed, right? But that is the basis for like the Enlightenment. This idea that we could just like perfectly logically rationally order society. But that goes all the way down to the way that people decided to paint or not paint buildings during the Enlightenment. So
Richard, what you're saying is like probably up there, maybe not quite, but up there, as if like parents sit you down and tell you, Sorry, son, you've been adopted." Like
yes, right. Yeah.
I've been living a lie
Yeah.
this whole time.
Yeah. I mean, and so I mean, color is a really important thing. I think that it's something we take for granted. As you can see, like my office is deliberately painted in a certain way, right? This is where I work and write and whatnot. Um, um, Color is not just like a nice to have. It's not a
Mm.
neutral thing. Colors really say certain things about the world, and the fact that this is an aspect of the ancient world that was rejected almost completely until very recently.
Mm, mm.
But actually, the ancient world, I mean, they did um, they did some exhibits recently where they basically reproduced the statues with the colors on them to kind of show what they were like. And I think that my
Oh my
only beef with
gosh.
that particular my only beef with that particular exhibit was that I think they didn't do a very good job. But it was the right
Mm,
idea. It was the right idea.
yeah.
I think they made them look kind of bad, and I think it's because they we're still trying to figure out exactly what pigments these were and stuff like that. But I think that but that's the right direction to be moving in. But if you understand this, then you kind of understand that the Middle Ages it's the flourishing of this culture that goes all the way back to antiquity, right? And that eventually, guided by Christianity, kind of blossoms and produces this beautiful icon of this eternal reality. And when you kind of pick and choose the part that you want, and just to try to make it safe and easy, and people do this. I mean, Orthodox people do this sometimes with like reductionist or revisionist version, like pop versions of history, but that's not there's nothing special about like Orthodox people doing it. Everybody does that, right? That like this sort of historical revisionism, because the actual world is so untidy. And my favorite example of this is if you took like a church in 15th century England. There's a great book about this that I'm always trying to hawk called "The Stripping of the Altars" by Eamon Duffy, who's a British historian.
It's just
And
stripping of the
the
altars.
stripping of the altars, which is
Okay.
basically it's about popular. It's on the shelf over there. It's on.
Haven't given that copy away yet.
I haven't given that copy away yet. I give away a lot of books, so like sometimes like what I have will just kind of depend on whether or not I bought a new one yet. But in the stripping of the altars, it's basically a look at popular religion in England before, on the eve of the Reformation. To basically, one of the things that he refutes in the stripping of the altars is this idea that the Reformation was this bottom-up movement in Europe, which it wasn't. It was really forced on people from the top down. And most people have, for instance, never heard of the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was this mass popular uprising against the Reformation in England that was put down by the crown.
Oh,
And again, that's a version of history most people have not heard. But anyway, in the stripping of the altars, one of the things that yeah, this is the book.
okay.
One of the things that Duffy does is he describes what a medieval church would have been like, just like your little parish church, which is what I'm really interested in as a historian, is like what was just like a normal guy like me, just like a lay person, a parishioner, what's your experience of God and of church and things like this.
Mhm.
And the way that he describes, these medieval churches, and some of them are still like this, especially if you go to the ones that haven't become like super touristy, right? In Western Europe or Eastern Europe. Uh, they have all these like little nooks and crannies, and this little nook and cranny is kind of like this is behind a pillar or off in a corner or something like that. There's an icon of a saint there and a little place to light candles, and
Mhm.
basically like these churches have so much going on. And then what happens after the Reformation is they say, no, 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 all of that is distracting you from the Bible or from the sermon or whatever. And so they have to clear all that stuff out, which they saw as clutter, but I see as life. But they have to clear all that stuff out that they see as clutter. And and now we have just four walls, and they're white, and we have pews. And it's funny, when I was
Mm.
in Lithuania a couple of years ago with Father Andrew Stephen Damick, we actually went to give a talk at the only Reformed church in Vilnius, in the capital city there. And it was the
What?
only it was the only church. Yeah, they have
Oh,
one, and they have a couple of Lutheran churches as well. But almost all of Lithuania is Roman Catholic, and there are some very beautiful Orthodox churches there as well, but it's
mm.
mostly Roman Catholic. But there's
Yeah.
one Reformed church, and we went in there, and it was you could tell it was the only Reformed church because it was the only church we went into with no art. It was
Mm.
just pews and white walls. And now it was still
Mm.
much nicer because it was an old building. It was still much nicer than any of the churches that I grew up in. But it was four white walls and a pulpit and pews,
Mm.
and that was it. And actually, the folks, we had some Symbolic World folks meet us out there, and one of them was, I think she attended there, but she was giving us like a tour, and she said she apologized. She's like, "I'm really sorry the walls are so bare like this." But I will say, a week after we went there, they put a statue of the Virgin Mary on top of the building. So did we have anything to
Okay.
do with that? I don't know, but it's there now, and
Influencer, Mr.
yeah,
Rohlin.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So anyway, all that to say,
Yeah.
I apologize for like going off on this tangent for so long, but I think it's really, when we talk about the image, right, it's really important to think of that as an icon that's
Hmm.
something that's been discarded or laid aside, but you could take it up again.
Hmm.
And it's not to say that you can just become it's not to say that you can just become a medieval person overnight or something like that, but you can take the icon up again, because the icon actually refers to an eternal reality, right? Because the kingdom
Hmm.
of heaven is really like that. It's not four walls and pews. It's just not. I'm sorry,
Okay. Yeah.
people who are upset by that, but it's not. I mean, the kingdom of heaven is full of all of these hierarchies and nooks and crannies, and
Right.
but then Christ is in every single one of them, right? That's why that's the real thing. You don't have to worry, like, am I getting too distracted from Jesus by like doing this other thing that's about Jesus? No, No,
Hmm.
not at all. Especially if you have the sort of like the stream of the liturgy to kind of organize all of that in. So anyway,
Right.
all that said, that's just the title. That's my long
Yeah. So
explanation,
first
just the
hour,
title of the
we've
book.
gotten 3 words in. Well, really two minus the article, but
That's right.
but all this is super helpful because if I'd listened to this, what you've said so far before I went into reading the book,
Yeah.
I don't think I would have put it down
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like I did the first time.
Yeah.
Because the first part it dives into those, like it gets zoomed in level. Like we're talking book reviews of 4 books I had never heard of. I mean, maybe Dante, but like so it was like a lot all at once, a lot of foreign information all at once.
Yeah.
And then I, you know, what really helped was universal history. Listening to your podcast with Jonathan Pageau helped a lot because it was kind of like the bite-size
Hmm.
versions of, stories I was a little bit more familiar with, and even some that I wasn't, like Ethiopia. But it does. It's almost like you have to learn the language, kind of like, people in art, it's like you have to
Yep.
learn the artistic language to really
That's right.
understand what you're seeing. Like, okay, yeah, the material, the pigments and the paints could be right in front of you. You can kind of see it, but like you don't perceive it. You don't understand the deeper meaning. And I know Lewis gets into that with like the layers of uh what the spheres, Slatum, the angelology. And so he
Hmm.
was like, this is a very layered hierarchical world.
That's right.
And so if I think we're ready. If you're ready, why don't
Yeah.
we dive into the model itself and kind of
Okay.
describe really what's going on?
Yeah. Um, so the thing that people probably know the most about the Middle Ages and like the medieval model, um, and is the idea that it's geocentric, right? So if you like asked a medieval person to make a map of the solar system, first of all, they would have been like, the what? You have to say the cosmos or the universe. Oh, okay. And so they would draw they here's Earth at the center, and then the moon, and then Mercury, and then Venus, and then the sun, and then Mars, and then Jupiter, and then and then they do the realm of the 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 moving constellations, the zodiac, and then the fixed stars, and then the prima mobile, and then out here the where God dwells. And so you could look at this and say, ah, these stupid, silly little medieval people, they thought humanity was the center of the universe. And that's just completely not right. What they thought was that humanity, that Earth was the bottom of the universe. So when the devil falls, in the Divine Comedy, the devil is sort of lodged at the very center of the earth, and you have to escape hell literally by climbing up his butt crack, which is
What?
an actual thing that happens in the Divine Comedy at the end of Inferno. Um, which Jonathan and I are going to do a class on this year. It'll start in Orthodox Bright Week, and we're going to go for 6 weeks just doing the Inferno, and then in a few months we'll do Purgatorio and then Paradiso. So
Interesting.
so we
Interesting.
have like if people did the Beowulf class with us, or if you want to just do a deep read of the Divine Comedy with me and Jonathan, there'll be an opportunity to do that later this year. But
Okay. I got to tell my
um
dad this too, because one of
yeah,
our really difficult mountain biking trails that we made
uh-huh.
together was called Satan's Crack.
Yeah. Well, it that's a I don't know what to say. Like there's a lot of butt jokes in the Inferno. But anyway, it's just
Yeah. I'm
um
going to share an
uh
image.
yeah,
Is this kind
yeah,
of like
this
an
is it.
imagistic
This is it. That's right.
expression of what you're talking about with the
That's right.
spheres? Okay.
That's right. So if you take a
Interesting.
look at this, uh, Earth is not at the center, it's at the bottom, right? It's at the bottom of the cosmos, right? Because every direction you go, and everyone in the Middle Ages, by the way, sorry, flat earthers, everybody in the Middle Ages knew the Earth was round. Um,
Mm.
this was not even something that was a question. Everybody since the ancient Greeks knew, the ancient Greeks also knew the world was round, which doesn't mean that you can't also depict it as flat for certain purposes. But people could do math. They could do math and figure out. I mean, they figured out the circumference of the Earth like you know centuries before Christ was born. So it's not. So they knew the Earth was round, which means that every direction you go from Earth is up. You see.
Okay. Okay.
Every direction you go from Earth is up. If people have read Ender's Game, there's that, like, the enemy's gate is down. I don't know if you've read Ender's Game. Um,
Hmm.
but the idea that the enemy's gate is down. Well, if you think about it, hell is down, right? So every direction away from hell is what? It's up, right? Um, because every direction you move away from Earth is towards God. And this is the basic idea of the medieval model. And so that the cosmos is laid out in this hierarchy around us, and the trick then is to make the leave this image up for a sec because there's something I want to talk about
Yep.
right here.
Yep.
But the trick then is to make the uh uh is to make the words of the Lord's Prayer a reality, that God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven,
Hmm.
right? And if you read church fathers talk about this, they say actually the earth is us. We're the earth, as in my earth, as it is in heaven, but also just in general. So the idea was that the even the realities of civil society, like the emperor and the king and so forth, that these should reflect as best as possible. They should reflect these heavenly realities.
So like if
Uh,
you're building out a city.
yeah, if you're building out a city, if you're and this is why Constantinople is so important, because it's the first city ever built from the ground up by Christians, right? There's
Mm.
no pagan, there were no, Constantine leveled Byzantium and then he built Nova Roma, like New Rome.
Mm.
And he built it without any pagan temples, right? So it was the first city in the ancient world built without a single pagan temple. Um, and
Mm.
obviously, of course, Old Rome, all the temples eventually become churches as well. But Constantinople is really important to understand this idea of the cosmos, because it's the city as cosmos. But
Mm.
you could also like flip that around and say in the Middle Ages they saw the cosmos as a city, right? And
Okay.
so this is one of the basic ideas of the medieval model, is that these things play out in these fractals. So the important thing to kind of point out here, and you can kind of see this if you look at the map of the Earth here, is that there's a line between the map of the cosmos is that you put up on the screen here. There's a
Hmm.
line between the Earth and the sphere of fire around it, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then the moon, and then everything else beyond the moon. So this is another one of the most important ideas in the discarded image. And the most important ideas in the Middle Ages is very frequently in medieval poetry, you'll have um, things will be referred to as being beyond the moon or translunar or something like this.
Mm.
And
Right.
the
Right.
idea is basically that everything beyond the circle of the moon, everything in the cosmos behaves according to kind of a fixed pattern, and everything obeys God. That's the main thing to take away from that. Whereas beneath the circle of the moon, there is change, decay, death, and
Mhm.
of course our human beings with free will running around mucking things up.
Right. Like cyclical time.
Yeah, cyclical time, but also it's not just cyclical time, because beyond the circle of the moon you have that as well, but
Mm.
it's more
True.
like decay, right? Which is really
Mm.
which is what
Like,
which is what chronological time is, right?
okay.
Change and decay, change and decay.
Should be like a mutability.
Yeah,
Like,
mutability is another good way.
okay.
So
Okay.
beyond the circle of the moon, there's still time in terms of things move, but they move according to a pattern that they eventually return to, right?
Mm.
Whereas beneath the circle of the moon, things kind of move according to a pattern that they return to. We have seasons that we cycle through and so on and so forth. Uh, but then there's also a changeability, right? Because also we die. Things don't die beyond the moon. So
Mm.
that's a really important idea here, and you can kind of see that on this. You can kind of see that on this map, if you want to call it that, of the medieval version of the cosmos. And so the term that Lewis uses in the medieval in the discarded image is that he says, nowadays that we see ourselves standing, if you look at like the ascent of man, right, the evolutionary model which is also a model. This is one of the things Lewis points out, is that the current like Darwinian evolution, or I think we're beyond, we've moved past Darwinian evolution now, and we've got some other theories out there. I don't really know though, because I don't really care. But we've moved past Darwinian evolution, but that sort of ascent of man, it's where like the apes, the lineup where the apes stand progressively more upright,
Yeah.
And so what Lewis says is that modern man actually thinks of ourselves as standing at the top of a staircase looking back. And we're like, oh, look at all of these things that we've evolved from and that we've transcended and that we've, and this is the myth of evolutionism, which in another essay somewhere else, Lewis talks about this more. And he says that the myth of evolutionism is separate from, it's really separate from, like the biological theory of evolution. And you shouldn't treat the two as though the same thing. Because the myth of evolution is this idea that the new must always usurp the old, right? And this is the main idea in Wagner, and it's the main idea in Nietzsche, and it's the main idea in like all these different, is that by its very newness, it's the main idea in Star Wars, right? If people want to think about it that way, which is very Wagnerian, deliberately so, in its music and in its use of light and dark and everything. Star Wars is all about like you have to kill your father and then like take his place, right? And this is what happens. This is what happens in the original Star Wars trilogy, but it's still there actually, even in the Star Wars sequel trilogy, the one that everybody hates. Justly, I think it's not great, but it is very authentic to the original spirit of Star Wars. That we all hated that scene where they're like burning all the Jedi books or whatever. But that's totally authentic to the spirit of Star Wars, which is always about the new thing coming along has to overthrow the old order, right? So that's the overthrowing. Has to overthrow. Yeah. So that's the myth, and that's why the main characters of Star Wars always have to be rebels, which it sort of becomes a problem then. And that's why these new Star Wars stories just are not very good. It's because it's like, well, we just had a rebellion. Well, yes, but what about second rebellion? So that's the modern model, you could say, and it's built off of this myth of evolutionism, this that the old order has to go, right?
And Lewis even uses the term that we're using a lot today, scientism.
Scientism, yeah, that's right.
Right, so it's kind of like what you're describing is something removed culturally. It's like a cultural movement more than like a scientific theory, let's say.
So the medieval model is totally different from that, because in the medieval model you are always building on the thing that came before you, right? So nobody in the Middle Ages thought, oh yes, though the classical period, yet those stupid benighted Romans and Greeks, we can do better than them, right? Everybody in the Middle Ages was essentially a classicist, right? Everybody in the Middle Ages was saying was trying to continue to build on the civilization, essentially the Greco-Roman civilization that they'd inherited. And this is why so first of all, this idea is the main idea of universal history. Like this is the main thing that we've been trying to help people understand. Not just Greco-Roman civilization, by the way, we'll talk about this in a minute, but also on the Semitic inheritance of Christianity. Like the whole idea of like hierarchies of angels, all that stuff, right? That comes straight from it's not a Greco-Roman thing, that comes straight from ancient Judaism and so on. But and then the other thing to kind of say about that is that part of you could say like the psyop, that went along, it was the same people that went along with like taking the color out of history, was the invention of the word Byzantine to talk about the Eastern Roman Empire. Nobody in the Eastern Roman Empire ever called themselves Byzantines, right? There is no I'm sorry everybody, there is no such thing as a Byzantine rite. Like that's it's a completely made up term.
Dude, you're just like blowing up lie after lie, man.
But the reason that term was brought in, it was brought in as a pejorative. Even today in English, when we want to say something is like overly complex, we say it's Byzantine, right? And that's never a good thing. Nobody's like, Nobody's like, oh yeah, I went down to the DMV. It was totally Byzantine, man. That would be, like if the DMV was actually Byzantine, that would be awesome, right? But it was kind of this pejorative way, and it's tied up with weird things. Like I'll give you an example. So I'm a Germanic philologist, specifically by discipline. One of the early theories about the Germanic languages is that so there's a series of sound shifts that are described by a linguistic law called Grimm's law. That
Mm.
was articulated by Jakob Grimm, who is of course famous for the fairy tales, right? But was actually a very serious philologist and linguist. And he, not that fairy tales aren't serious, but anyway, um, he expressed this uh linguistic change, and a good example is the word hundred in Germanic languages starts with an H, right? But it has the same root in Proto-Indo-European as the centum in Latin, which starts with a k. So one of the things that defines the sound shift of Germanic languages as they become their own sort of separate dialect of languages from Proto-Indo-European is the shift from k to, right,
Mm.
which are related. You notice you just do something slightly different with your throat, right? But they're both kind of breathy. So there was an early theory, actually, that the reason that Germanic peoples had this change is because they were just naturally breathier. And the reason that they were breathier is because they were just so much more active than all of these decadent Mediterranean civilizations. And so one of the things that this kind of produces in the 19th century as part of, and even before that, as part of like, uh, European nationalism and whatnot, is this idea that the Germanic people and that the Anglo-Saxon people, like they're harder workers and they're more aggressive and they're more assertive and all these different things because they have a naturally like more assertive language than these decadent Mediterranean people who are just like sitting around taking a siesta all day. And it's like, yeah, the hardworking English versus the lazy Italians or the lazy Greeks or the lazy, basically anybody from the Mediterranean. And so there was this I mean, this is one of the main ideas, and you still see people that believe this stuff, which is um which is mostly nonsense. I mean, certainly there is such a thing as like the Protestant work ethic and stuff like that, but the idea that it just goes back to we have like a breathier language is a pretty silly theory, which nobody really believes or teaches anymore. But it's part and parcel with this idea that the stuff that came out of the East, like the Byzantine civilization, that's decadent and perfumed and effeminate and all these different things, not like us, big, strong Germanic peoples. And of course, if you'd said this to anybody, like to any Viking or any Anglo-Saxon warrior king or something like this, they would have thought you were just crazy,
Mm.
because of course they loved for them Constantinople was Miklagard, the great city, right?
Mm.
And that's where they send all of their princes to be educated and to work as mercenaries and all this different stuff, right? So there is definitely something about the symbolism of the northern barbarian and the importance for good or for ill that it has for Roman culture. But this whole idea of like the Byzantine East is it's a construct that was part of the sort of same uh it's part of the same kind of revisionism that produces things like whitewashed stone pillars and
Okay.
Enlightenment construction and things like this. So
Mhm.
I don't remember how we got here. I'm off on another tangent,
Yeah,
but
well, I'll tell you this. This is also helpful in maybe explaining why I wasn't necessarily set up to win with reading The Discarded Image because
yeah,
it had all of these other things that you're kind of
yeah,
like bursting
yeah.
that I
Well, so this is the thing. Like, this is what I'm trying to get at, is that if you take the world that Lewis is describing, if you look at it, he goes straight from antiquity, like Ovid, and also the ascent of like Cicero's, like the ascent of Scipio and things like that. He goes straight from there, and also the Bible, which is an Eastern product, right? He goes right straight from there into like the Western Middle Ages, and sort of shows how there's this just cohesive picture, this development, this line, right? He talks about the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. Jonathan just had a video about it on his channel. To my great consternation, I was not part of that conversation, but it's a really good conversation. And Boethius is a very, very important book to me. I have probably 3 or 4 copies around here, but it's you know, one of the things that Lewis says about it in The Discarded Image is that to love this book is to become a naturalized citizen of the Middle Ages,
Mm.
right? If you can, and Boethius is, I think, one of the most important books that's ever been written. So,
Wow.
and Lewis, The Discarded Image was my introduction to it, and I definitely recommend people go watch that conversation that Jonathan just had on his channel about it, and then go read it. Very important, very important book. But all of this stuff is coming out of the sort of the same world, and that world is very, it's beautiful, it's colorful, it's messy, it's not tidy. The medievals were a real study in contradictions, in the sense, because in the one sense they were great systematizers. They were always coming up with like new ways to categorize things, but at the same time they didn't think in systematic terms like we do, right? They they didn't think in, in the way that we think in terms of laws. And this is the big idea, to bring it back around to Discarded Image, is that the medieval model doesn't think of a world which consists of laws.
Then what do they think of it as?
It's a world moved by love.
Ah.
So this is what Lewis says at the end, right? He says it's pretty silly to think of the cosmos as this world where there's a law of gravity, like there's some traffic court somewhere, and if I violate the law of gravity, then I'm gonna get a ticket or a citation or be put in jail or something like that, right? That's
Right.
like that's a pretty silly way to think about the world, but that's our idiom. And the reason that we think about it that way is because that's the society that we live in, which is mainly one of laws. But in the Middle Ages, but what Lewis is trying to say is that it's not inherently silly to think of this idea of kindly inclining, this idea of things being basically moved towards each other through love, right? It's not like people in the Middle Ages didn't know that apples fall when, down. Like Newton wasn't sitting under a tree and, said, "Egads, I've just noticed, like apples fall down. I wonder why that is." Of course, everyone knew that it worked this way. They just explained it differently, right? The apple is made of earth, and it's trying to get back to the earth because that's what it's made from, right? And so everything's trying to get back to where it comes from. And the tricky thing about being a human being is that you have 2 parts of yourself. You have a body which comes from the earth, but then you have a soul which comes from God. And so the soul is always trying to get back to God, and the body is always trying to draw you back down to the earth. And the deep mystery of being a human being is that the resurrection, the transfiguration of the human person, is not just you die and you go to heaven. It's that the earth itself is also transfigured and resurrected, right? And this is what the sons of the resurrection become sons of God equal to the angels, right? And so we actually elevate all of creation, the whole created order, with us in that moment that we're resurrected. I really recommend people go and get I wish I could remember what volume it's in, but Father Dimitri Stadoloi was an Orthodox confessor and theologian of the last century. He has in his master, very long multi-volume series on dogmatic theology. He has a chapter towards the end on the resurrection. It's one of the most beautiful things I think you'll ever read. But he talks about this. He talks about the transfiguration of Christ and how it foreshadows the resurrection and this redemption of all the cosmos, right? But that redemption of the cosmos is possible because the cosmos is held together and moved ultimately by the love of God. Dante calls it the love at the very end of the Paradiso, the love that moves the sun and the other stars, right? That's so anyway, that's kind of my best pitch for The Discarded Image, not just the book itself, which is a really beautiful introduction, but to the whole world that it introduces. Is that it will introduce you to a world which is moved by love, and it's a much more, in some senses, dangerous world. I think there's something about the idea of a world that's just held together by these perfectly regular laws, which, by the way, aren't actually perfectly regular, but they seem to be most of the time. something about that I think feels very safe and ordered
Hmm.
and tidy, right? But the medieval cosmos, just like the medieval church, is an untidy and colorful place.
Yeah,
And
wild.
that's gonna make, and so yeah, there's a wildness to it. There's a wildness to it. There's a wildness to Christ, right? Yeah, there's a wildness to Christ in the Gospels. Not a tidy person is Jesus Christ, to kind of bring it all back around. And so in
Hmm.
that sense, I think the medieval cosmos, if we're looking at it as an image, as an icon, then there's something more true about that than the one that we inhabit today, or the one that we
Well, let's get back
embrace
to
and accept
the
today.
that staircase analogy. You
Yeah.
described the first one of scientism and the myth of evolution. What's the other one? How would a medieval man?
Yeah, so
Go ahead.
what Lewis says is that man sees himself standing at the bottom of a staircase looking up.
Mm,
And you're looking up into these complex hierarchies of angels and saints and stars and all these things, right? And then God at the top. But then the thing that you're supposed to do is ascend the staircase. And so, the goal has always been going all the way back to. I thought maybe I was going to talk a little bit about the Book of Jubilees, but I think we're going to run out of time. But that's, if you want to hear about the Book of Jubilees, come to the conference, come
there
to
we
the summit.
go.
But
Yes.
but going back all the way to this really old, all this really old Semitic stuff, right?
Mm,
Human deification has always been the goal. Theosis is,
mm,
or deification, if you want the Latin term, but it's man ascending the staircase. And then the thing is that each step of the staircase is its own little staircase, and at every step and every little step, Christ is there,
mm,
right? And so you sort of ascend this fractal, the series of fractal patterns towards God, but then God is everywhere present, filling all things at each one of those stages along the way.
mm.
And this is something that they intuited even in the pre-Christian world. Lewis talks about this in when he talks about the ascent of Scipio, which is kind of an early expression of some of these ideas. But it's a this idea of the ascent, right? The ascent towards God, is also what we mean by theosis, or human deification, or something like this. And it's taking up the things of earth as Christ did, right? Christ takes a body of earth and then he ascends with it into heaven, right? I can tell you how many times somebody would ask me when I was a Protestant minister, so what happened to Jesus' body after his ascent? Like, did it just fall off, or like what,
Mm.
because they couldn't get their head around the idea that God could still have a physical body. But of course he does. Christ didn't get rid of his body. It's part of him. It's part of who he is. And but it's going to be the same for all of us. That's why we look for the resurrection of the dead, a real bodily resurrection. That's the fundamental hope of our faith as Christians. Without that, you're some kind of a Gnostic.
Mm.
So yeah, bottom of the staircase looking up, but then also it's a staircase. It's not a, I don't know, it's not a wall. It's a staircase. So you're meant to climb. You're meant to
Hmm.
ascend. Yeah.
Yeah. I know another thing that he had mentioned too in that section. I really like the chapter on heavens. I think that one, at least
Yeah,
in his
yeah, yeah.
season of life, like really opened up a lot of things. Um, One of the things too he talks about is the what did he call it? Didn't call it reason. He called it ratio,
Mm-hmm.
and
Ratio,
was
yeah,
it
yeah,
intellectum?
yeah. Yes.
I found that really interesting. Whereas maybe you could speak into it, but that section it really helped understand was like there was a place for reason, but it wasn't the
Yes.
ultimate thing, right? There
Yeah.
was this a revelatory understanding of the things that we receive that is, um, it seemed like they had more of a priority for that, and reason had its place, but it wasn't at the peak of what they were ascending to of understanding.
Right. Yeah, the big kind of difference here is what intellect means. This is, nowadays when we say intellect, we just mean like your brain, right? But really your intellect is something closer to, um and don't at me here, because different church fathers use kind of like different words for some of these things. And but when we talk about something like being spiritual or noetic, this Greek word, the nous, right? that's really when a Latin writer uses the word intellect. This is what they mean. It's your ability. It's like a
Okay.
it's like a spiritual sensory organ, right? It's your ability to perceive truth. If
Mhm.
you read in the ancient world, so and so has a great intellect, what we don't mean is that they're a very smart person. What we mean is that they have the ability to um uh um the ability to perceive truth, the ability to be sensitive to um the say it's like the ability to be sensitive to higher realities, something like that, right? And so Lewis says the belief that to recognize a duty was to perceive a truth, not because you had a good heart, but because you were an intellectual being, has its roots in antiquity. So this idea that you would recognize something as being true about the world, but that recognition comes from the um, that recognition comes from the fact that you have an intellect, you have a nous, and therefore this ability to kind of apprehend these higher realities. That's what it means to
Mm.
be an intellectual, right? And so usually spirits like angels and so on are talked about are often referred to in like medieval Latin writing as being intellects. They're intellects.
Mm.
And it doesn't mean they're just like brains floating around in the void or something like this, but they're
Mm.
all intellect, right? In other words, they 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 don't have they completely relate to, you could say, like the spiritual principle or the higher principle, something like that. I mean, this is one of those things where the ways that we use these words, imagination, intellect, reason, so on and so forth, have just changed so much. They changed so much that it is very hard to get back to an original way of using them. And so sometimes it is useful to just like bring in a bit of from the standpoint of English, like a foreign word, something like nous, because it's easier to, because it doesn't already have a meaning in English, so it's like easier to introduce a new concept in that way. Um, but I think that section, yeah, on ratio, on ratio or ratio and
Mhm.
and and
Right.
and intellectus, that's a very important section if you want to just sort of, and it's important because it'll help you understand yourself better, but also if you don't know what's meant by these things, you will just completely misread almost every work of medieval literature if you ever decide
Mhm.
you want to go back and read the primary sources.
Right. And he even says that the way that we talk about reason is a much more narrowed way than if
That's
we were
right.
to read books and literature from the Middle Ages, then it's like they're kind of talking about much more. I mean, so like one piece of it might be what we mean and understand today,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but it's a whole lot more.
Yeah. And you can think about how in the modern world, uh, just take that word intellect, right? In the modern world, we've just narrowed it down to basically just the things happening in your brain,
Mhm.
right? And in many ways, even though we know more about the world from the aspect of, let's say, physical sciences, and I definitely
Mhm.
have an immediacy of knowledge about what is the Pope doing in Rome today that I wouldn't have had in the Middle Ages, those sorts of things, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, not always a good thing, I think.
Yeah,
But we definitely have more access to information and more access to um, and certainly a greater amount of knowledge about the physical world and so on and so forth. But in many ways, our perspective is much narrower
Mhm.
because we've taken certain aspects of creation and we've said this is all there is. And so we've
Yeah.
gone as deep as we can and really spent all of our, let's say, our energies in trying to deepen our understanding of those aspects of creation and really just ignored other things about ourselves entirely. And now all that stuff is hitting back, right? And that's why
Mhm.
as society begins to fragment, people just goes chasing these weird spiritualities and, different stuff. And but it's all because I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said a million times before now, but it's because we've neglected this part of ourselves for so long.
Mm.
And now
Right.
it's to the point that we've starved ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
so now like when somebody's starving, they don't care what they eat. They just want to eat,
totally,
right?
yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was part of like I would call it like the neo hippie group,
yeah,
or especially like kind of combined with like expatriates living in Costa Rica or parts of Mexico,
Yeah.
and it's just really interesting because they have such a spiritual thirst and hunger, and they, like you said, they'll just feed it with wow, oh my gosh, and like the sparkles, and it just looks so
Yeah.
amazing. What a feeling. And
Yeah.
then, a day later, oh my goodness, this other thing, this
Yes.
thing from this continent, this thing from this other part of the world,
Yeah.
um, which I think is there is a purity, a pure intention in that,
Yeah.
but without like the structure that we're describing with this model, where it's like people, the cool thing I like too is people at every level of society had a place and a purpose. I think one of the maybe you're about to bust this lie too.
No, go
Thanks.
ahead.
But it feels like when we look back at people like, oh, these barbarians from this horrible dark ages, right?
Yeah.
Which we made it a whole hour and a half so far, and we haven't even used that term
Yeah.
for a reason. Um, we look at it and we think, oh, those poor peasants, oh, the fiefdoms, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, say on one side you could say, oh, a pre-capitalistic era,
Right.
the other side, oh, the oppressive,
Fascist,
yeah,
whatever. Yeah.
fascist and all this classism and all, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's like no matter which way you're looking at it, they're both negative,
Yeah.
towards this time. But then you read Lewis, and then what does he say? He's like, no, everybody felt empowered with a purpose.
Yeah.
They're all part of something greater
Yeah.
than themselves and collectively working at it.
Yeah. And it's not to say that people weren't unhappy or didn't suffer. Because people will always be unhappy and suffer. There's nothing, I mean, one of the worst things that I think we have tried to do is basically essentialize the elimination of human suffering as this is the mark of a highly evolved state.
Mm,
And it's tricky because on the one hand, like how could you say you're against that? Like of course I don't want to see people suffer, especially not,
mm,
people that I care about. But
yeah.
the the, the but also you need to be able to sort of recognize that suffering is a part of human existence, and it's a part of the world that we live in, and that even Christ, when he comes, he doesn't eliminate anybody's suffering, right? He suffers, right? He enters into suffering to fill it with himself. And there's maybe something going a little wrong. This is why, I mean, in really extreme cases, such as what's happening in Canada right now, we've gone so far to eliminate suffering that now people are just depressed and miserable and old. And
Mm,
and so what do we need to do? Well, we need to eliminate their suffering one step further, right? By helping them like commit medical suicide, right? And I
mm,
mean, that's the elimination. That's where it goes, because this is the weird sort of paradox. The more you work to eliminate, if you work to totally eliminate all human suffering, eventually the only way to do this is to eliminate humans, right? And Lewis is weirdly
yeah.
prescient about this in That Hideous Strength, the third book in his cosmic trilogy. He's weirdly prescient about this. But
Mm,
there's a so it's not that no one in the Middle Ages suffered, or that, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that bad things didn't happen, but also, the bad things that one of the things is that, yeah, there were wars, but the wars were not at the scale that we have wars now. Like we have, you know, it's just, if you look at the horrors of the 20th century, and even the horrors that are now going on in the 21st century, it's at so much more of a scale than anything that happened in the Middle Ages. At least in the Middle Ages, you had laws of war that were mostly almost always followed.
mm, mm,
You had certain days that you couldn't fight on, things like this, very different situation than what we have now. But the one of the things that's really beautiful to me about medieval Christianity is what Charles Taylor calls variable speed Christianity.
mm.
And this is one that we might have to stop here because I've got something else I got to do in 5 minutes.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Um, but uh, he talks about variable speed Christianity, and it's one of the things that Calvin's Geneva basically tries to eliminate. And so the idea of variable speed Christianity is that you could have a peasant and a monk and a king, and the things that Christianity expects from each of them is different, right? For
Mm,
the peasant, I mean, you read this in the Church Fathers, everybody wants to go read like all the great ascetic literature and all that stuff. But if you, at the beginning of, for instance, the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is one of the greatest works of ascetic literature ever written, St. John says, "I'm writing this for monks. If you're a layperson, do these five things, and you'll go to you'll be saved." Right?
oh, yeah.
Do these five things. Very simple. defraud anybody, don't lie, be faithful in your marriage, go to
Mhm.
church, confess your sins. That's it. It's very simple if you're a lay person, actually.
Mhm.
You don't have to get overcomplicated with all this different stuff. He's writing the ladder for monks, so the idea is that monks are intended to go at this speed. But
Mm.
if you're a peasant, then maybe you go at this speed, and if you're a king, something else is also required of you, right? And that could be okay. There could be room for all of those things in the kingdom of God.
Mm.
What happens specifically in Calvin's Geneva, this is according to Taylor, but I think he's right about it, is that basically they try to say, no, everyone's got to go at the same speed, and that speed has to be maximum. If you're not going at maximum speed, then you're not really a real Christian. And
Mm.
even in the evangelical circles I grew up in, there was kind of this idea that, well, listen, if you weren't in ministry somehow, like if you weren't like a missionary or something, then you're not like one of the real Christians. You're not like one of the super Christians. You're not, um, and so one of the things that happened in Geneva is that, they had people who would keep an eye on like how much silverware do your neighbors have, right? Because maybe they have too much, which means that they're kind of materialistic. And what we need to do is bring the city in, like bring the state in to essentially make
Mm.
sure that they're not being too materialistic. So we're going to confiscate some of that silverware and things like that. That's an extreme example, but it's one that really happened.
Mm.
If so the idea then became everybody's got to be always going at the same speed, and that speed always has to be maximum. And traditional Christianity is not to say that there isn't a push-pull. There's always people in, like, especially if you're like you're a pastor of some kind, you're always trying to get the people to do more, to be more committed, to actually, stop fornicating and stop getting drunk and like all these things. Like, so it's not to say that there isn't always push-pull, but there were kind of, again, variable speeds, right? Different speeds to the faith, Christianity.
Mhm.
But the idea was never supposed to be that, yeah, if you're one of those peasants and you're living a faithful life and you're pious, I mean, and you have to remember, like, being a pious peasant still meant going to church every day,
Mm.
like before you went to but you're living a pious life. There was no idea that person is like less of a Christian than this monk, but also everybody knew the monk was more of a Christian. You see, like
Mm.
you can have some people holier than other people, and also that's okay because the whole cosmos is laid out that way. Like,
Mm.
it's just the way
Mm.
that it is. And this is one of the most difficult things for people to get to, and it's the same thing that keeps them from accepting traditional Christianity as a whole.
Yeah.
Is this idea that some people are closer to God than others. And you could
Mm.
do two things with that information. One is you could say, some people are closer to God than others, so I should get to know those people and try to get close to God, right?
Yeah.
The other thing you could do is say, no, 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 I'm going to pull everybody down. I'm going to pull
Yeah.
everybody down, so it's just a flat level,
Right.
just me and God,
Mhm.
right? So, yeah, I really want to keep talking about this stuff, but I'm really sorry. I have to
I
go
know you
now.
have to hop off. I think I'll just read a couple quotes and
Yeah,
we'll click end to the recording. So I'm going to read these from my notes. I will be publishing some notes for people that are interested. Um, one is from page 109. Sometimes the old intuitions survive. When they do not, we falter. And the other one is he's talking about realization of this medieval model, and he's encouraging people that the recipe for such realization is not the study of books, and he encourages people to go out for a midnight stroll and gaze upon the night sky. So kind of comes back to what you're talking about is take your time. This is practical, to
yeah,
really be able to perceive some of these things.
yeah.
So
It's really not hard to start participating in this stuff. I mean, yeah, go read the stuff, but some of these books are hard. It might take people a long time, but you
mhm,
can like go stargazing, go to church on a Sunday
mhm.
morning, things like that.
You can't neglect that part of the process
Yeah,
in all
yeah,
of this.
yeah, that is part of the process. And
Yeah.
that's the main thing I was trying to say earlier is like, don't just do all the stuff from your armchair. It's way too
Mm.
easy and it's very safe. But you got to go do the dangerous thing and like find a traditional church and go to church on a Sunday morning, and you're going to meet people who like are crazy
Mhm.
and or lukewarm or steal your umbrella or like whatever. Like, you're going to meet all kinds of crazy kinds of people,
Yeah.
and it's not going to be nearly as safe as just like doing the stuff in your armchair at home. But it's the real thing. It's real life. So
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm
Can't
sorry
wait to
that
see you in
we didn't even
Florida.
get to the other stuff. But like I said, come to Florida. I'm going to be talking about weird stuff about Genesis, and I'm really excited about it.
Okay.
But yeah, you have to come to Florida to hear it. So,
Okay.
all
Well,
right,
until then,
all right,
yeah,
brother. Be
take
well.
care. Bye-bye.